I opened my barn door and saw folding chairs, not one or two, 12 of them, perfectly aligned in a crescent like some goat-fearing cult was about to summon BWS from the underworld. At the front was a squeaky whiteboard that read, Mandatory HOA Attendance. Agenda, 3B Lawn Length Violations. And dead center, in all her smug glory, sipping cucumber-infused water from a glass tumbler, was Karen Miller. My Karen. Not my as in possession, mine as in the HOA's reigning dictator with a god complex and a voice like an irritated clarinet. I hadn't even closed my truck door yet, and already I felt like I'd stepped into a nightmare hosted by HGTV's evil twin. My barn. My chairs. My barn wood that I hand-sanded after retiring from 28 years of running into burning buildings. And this woman was holding court in it like Queen Elizabeth of Lawnville. I stood there for a moment, blinking, trying to figure out if I'd suffered a stroke or just aged into a parallel universe where consent didn't apply to senior citizens with property lines. Karen didn't even flinch when she saw me. She glanced in my direction with a tight smile and said, "Walter, wonderful timing. We're just getting started." She gestured to the chair right next to a bored-looking Dave Reynolds from 2 houses down. Dave gave me the look of a man who'd rather be buried alive than caught in the middle of this showdown. My boots were still dusty from the feed store. I hadn't even had my afternoon nap, and here I was, being invited into a coup happening inside the sacred walls of my private barn. "Karen," I said slowly, "what in the flying flaming barbecue are you doing in my barn?" She had the audacity to laugh, not a real laugh, mind you, but one of those high-pitched, passive-aggressive giggles that people like her use instead of saying, "I know this is insane, but you're too polite to punch me." She walked toward me, arms spread like she was offering a hug that would end in a knife to the back. "Walter," she said, "the HOA bylaws clearly state that any available common use space within our jurisdiction may be utilized for emergency meetings." I blinked. This barn is not a common use anything. It's where I hang out with goats, fix up old chairs, and yell at squirrels. Karen raised a single eyebrow, like she was trying to lift her whole face with one muscle. "Well, given that there's no official definition of common use, we've taken the liberty to define it for situations such as these." I glanced around. The rest of the neighborhood sat there like church mice in purgatory, sipping water and pretending not to see my veins bulging from my temple. I caught eyes with Ted from across the cul-de-sac. He offered a weak shrug, the kind that said, "Look, man, I've got a mortgage and a wife who plays bunco with Karen. I'm not dying on this hill." I took a deep breath and stepped into the barn, letting the door swing shut behind me. The creak of the hinges echoed like a final warning bell. I walked slowly, letting my boots thud against the wooden floor. Each step was deliberate, a sound check of my rising fury. I stopped right in front of the whiteboard. It had bullet points, actual bullet points. Noise pollution, lawn length, unauthorized fencing. "You brought up fencing in my barn," I said, staring her down. "Well, it's a hot-button issue, Walter," she said, folding her arms. "And given your, shall we say, colorful yard decor, we felt it was appropriate to discuss it in a neutral setting." I looked around once more. "Neutral, Karen? This is where I keep my welding torch and a goat named Mr. Pickles. This is about as neutral as my underwear drawer." That got a few muffled snickers from the back row. Karen didn't like that. Her lips twitched, then tightened like she'd just bitten into a lemon soaked in vinegar. "Walter," she said with forced calm, "we're trying to build community. This meeting is essential for that." I tilted my head. "So naturally, you decided to break into a man's barn and hold a secret tribunal?" "No one broke in," she said quickly. "The side door was unlocked, because I just walked out of it an hour ago to get goat feed. Not because I invited a pack of HOA zealots to come sit where I oil my saddles." Karen wasn't backing down. She never did. This woman once fined a mother of 3 for using non-regulation Halloween decorations. She was the type of person who printed the HOA handbook on linen paper and slept with it under her pillow. She stared me down with those judgmental hawk eyes, waiting for me to get flustered, to raise my voice, to give her something she could call aggressive conduct. But I wasn't giving her that satisfaction. "Not yet. I want everyone out," I said, calm but firm. Now, the silence in the barn was so thick you could have sliced it with a cheese knife. Karen looked around, calculating. Then she smiled sweetly and said, "We'll be done in 20 minutes. Walter, surely you can be NAB for that long." "Nap." She used the word like it was a dagger, and she just slid it between my ribs. I nodded slowly, turned around, and walked out the door. I didn't say another word, not because I was defeated, but because I had already decided what came next. She had no idea who she'd messed with. Outside, I leaned against my truck, lit a cinnamon stick, gave up cigars years ago, and watched the barn from a distance. My barn, my rules. I was Walter Peterson, retired firefighter, goat enthusiast, and the last man on this block who remembered what it was like before Karen turned everything into a bureaucratic boot camp. She wanted to declare war? Fine. But she should have checked my history, because once upon a time, I fought fires with my bare hands. Now, I was about to fight fire with goats. Lots and lots of goats. The plan came to me somewhere between feeding Mr. Pickles his lunch and staring blankly at the calendar where Karen had scribbled HOA noise violation hearing, Walter's yard, in red ink. The woman had turned passive aggression into an Olympic sport, and I was tired of playing defense. If she wanted to march into my barn like it was her personal auditorium, then I'd give her an audience she'd never forget. And who better than my four-legged companions, each one horned, unpredictable, and completely immune to HOA regulations. I called Jorge. If anyone could help me pull this off, it was him. Jorge had been my friend for over 3 decades. We met when his barn caught fire, and I pulled him out with 2 goats under each arm. Since then, he's owed me, and I never once collected. Until now. I told him what happened. There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of his hearty laugh, then silence. Then how many goats we talking? All of them, I said. Jorge whistled. You serious? As serious as a citation for decorative birdhouses. By the next morning, just after sunrise, Jorge pulled up with his beat-up livestock trailer. The side of it had the words Moonlight Acres faded on the metal, and it smelled exactly how you'd expect a vehicle filled with farm animals to smell. Inside were 57 goats, some small, some big, all of them ready to chew through drywall if it came to it. I walked along the trailer with a clipboard, calling out names like a sergeant inspecting his troops. Niblet, Princess Fuzzy, Gary, the twins Chump and Stump, and of course Carl, who once chewed through a car tire in under 10 minutes and looked like he'd do it again for fun. We parked the trailer just behind my tool shed, so it wouldn't be visible from the street. Karen would never see it coming. I spent the next few hours prepping the barn like it was a theater stage. Folding chairs? Still in place. Whiteboard? I added a few enhancements, namely goat-sized hoofprints in permanent marker and the words, "Barn means barn," scrolled across the top. The table where Karen had placed her neatly arranged cucumber water had been replaced with a trough of molasses and feed pellets. I even left out her favorite glass tumbler, now repurposed as a goat salt lick. By noon, I was on my second cup of coffee and watching the final pieces fall into place. Jorge helped herd the goats inside the barn in small groups, making sure they were comfortable, curious, and slightly chaotic. One of them immediately climbed onto the hay bales and began bleating like it was reciting Shakespeare. Another chewed through a corner of Karen's laminated handouts. It was perfect. I didn't want anyone to get hurt, of course. I just wanted Karen to understand boundaries in a way she couldn't ignore. Words didn't work with her. Reason bounced off her like rain on a duck's back. But goats? Goats had a way of making themselves known. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't care about charters or yard color palettes. They just existed, loud, stubborn, and free, just like I used to be before Karen turned my golden years into an ongoing HOA tribunal. By evening, the barn was full. The goats were already making themselves at home. Some were butting heads gently in the corner. A few were testing the tensile strength of Karen's ease. One, I believe it was Niblet, had discovered that her tote bag tasted vaguely of rosemary and was now attempting to consume the entire thing. I set up a couple of trail cameras on the inside beams to catch everything. This wasn't just a stunt. This was justice with a tail and 4 hooves. The next morning, I woke up early, made myself a hearty breakfast, and sat on the porch with my coffee and binoculars. I knew Karen's patterns better than she probably knew them herself. She was nothing if not predictable. At 8:42 a.m. on the dot, her white SUV rolled up to the curb with an urgency usually reserved for ambulance runs. She stepped out, clipboard in hand, eyes locked on the barn like it owed her money. From my seat, I couldn't see her expression when she opened the door, but I heard it. There was a sound, a shriek, not a scream of fear, but the cry of a woman whose entire sense of order had just been sucker-punched by chaos in hooved form. Then came the thunder of hooves. Karen stumbled back, clutching her bag as Carl the goat emerged like a conquering general, and strutted past her toward the mailbox. Within seconds, the rest followed. The barn erupted. Goats poured out like a living flood. They scattered into the yard, across the street, and onto neighbors' lawns. Mrs. Jensen's garden gnome collection was under siege. Ted's prize-winning chrysanthemums never stood a chance. And in the middle of it all, Karen stood frozen, her clipboard now being nibbled on by a goat in a floral collar. The camera inside the barn caught every second. Karen stepping into the meeting space, realizing something was off, and then getting chased out by a dozen bleeding invaders. I walked down the porch steps, coffee in hand, as she turned to face me. "Walter," she shouted, breathless and wide-eyed. "What? What is this? What did you do?" I took a long sip of coffee and smiled. "Oh, I didn't do anything, Karen. Looks like you scheduled a meeting on a busy day." The goats had it first. She sputtered, looking for words. Behind her, Gary the goat was chewing on her car antenna like it owed him rent. "This is outrageous," she snapped. "This is a violation of multiple codes. You can't have livestock this close to residential properties." "You had no problem walking into my barn yesterday," I said. "Thought it was a common-use space?" "That's different," she barked. "Not really. You walked in without permission, disrupted my peace, and held a meeting in my private space. All I did was let the rightful tenants of the barn enjoy their morning." She opened her mouth, closed it, then stormed off toward her car, only to find that a goat had chewed the weather stripping off her driver's side door. She let out a strangled cry and turned back, heels clicking furiously on the pavement. "You will hear from the HOA board." "I sure hope so," I said. "They're all invited to the next barn meeting. Same time next week. We'll be discussing goat integration policies." As she drove off, horn blaring, windshield smeared with muddy hoof prints, I turned to the goats, still roaming, still munching, still making that glorious mess. "Well, boys," I said, tipping my hat, "I'd say round one goes to us." The following day, it wasn't the sound of birds or goats that woke me up, but the sharp, deliberate knock of someone who believed deeply in their own authority. I shuffled to the door in my slippers, opened it, and there she was, Karen Miller, armed with a manila envelope, a stiff spine, and an expression like she'd chewed a lemon but was pretending it was caviar. Standing just behind her was a man in a suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Judging by the small HOA badge clipped to his coat pocket, I figured this was their latest power play. "Walter Peterson," she said, as though confirming I hadn't been replaced in the night. "You've been served." She handed me the envelope like she was bestowing a royal decree. I took it, opened it slowly, and read the top line out loud. "Formal notice of violation. Unauthorized livestock. Destruction of community property. Threatening behavior toward HOA president." I looked up and blinked. "Threatening behavior?" Karen crossed her arms. "You unleashed wild animals on a scheduled community meeting." I leaned on my cane for effect, not because I needed to, but because it made me look more patient than I was feeling. "Karen," I said, "those goats are better trained than half the board. The only wild behavior was from you. Trespassing, disrupting my personal property, and drinking my goat's cucumber water." She ignored me and motioned to the man beside her. "This is Alan Withers, legal representative for the HOA." Mr. Withers gave me a small nod, looking about as enthusiastic as a man trapped between a boulder and a bureaucrat. I could already tell he wasn't ready for what he'd walked into. "Walter," he said cautiously, "we'd like to resolve this amicably. The HOA board believes." I cut him off with a wave of my hand. "The HOA board doesn't believe anything that Karen doesn't tell them to believe. They are scared of her. Half of them are married to her friends. The other half are terrified of winding up with a dozen code violations just for planting daisies." Alan hesitated, then sighed. "Look, let's be honest. This situation has escalated. The board is issuing a fine of $500 for violation of livestock ordinances and an additional $200 for damages caused during the meeting." "Damages? You mean the hoofprint on her reusable whiteboard?" "That's considered property destruction under section," Karen cut in, already too impatient to let the legalese finish. "And I've also filed a personal complaint. I was emotionally distressed. Your goat attacked my handbag." "My goat has excellent taste," I replied. "That bag was a war crime against leather. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a declaration of war dressed up in paperwork and scented with lavender fabric softener." I nodded, took the envelope, and closed the door in their faces without another word. I stood there in my hallway for a moment, letting the silence settle. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was something deeper, worn, tired of watching this community, the one my wife and I moved into decades ago, turned into a spreadsheet of petty rules and power trips. Later that afternoon, I took a quiet walk to Maggie's garden in the backyard. The roses she planted were blooming. I knelt, brushed some leaves aside, and sat down on the bench we built together back when our hands didn't ache in the mornings. I talked to her like I always did when things got heavy. I told her about Karen's latest stunt, the goats, the fine. I told her how sometimes I felt like I was the last stubborn piece of an older world that didn't fit here anymore. Then I smiled because I knew what she would have said, probably something like, "Well, Walt, if you're going to be a thorn in someone's side, make sure it's at least a thorn with a little flair." That night, I was on the porch sipping some hot cider when my neighbor Henry dropped by. Henry was a quiet guy, lived 3 houses down, always kept to himself. He stood there awkwardly before saying, "You know, Walter, I just wanted to say I thought what you did with those goats was kind of amazing." I raised an eyebrow. "You did?" He nodded. "Karen's been pushing everyone around for years. Nobody had the guts to stand up to her. You turned your barn into a protest with horns." That's poetic, honestly. Over the next 2 days, more neighbors started coming out of the woodwork. A mother of 2 left me cookies with a note that said, "Best civil disobedience I've seen in years." Even Ted, who always looked like he was 5 minutes from a panic attack, gave me a discreet thumbs up when Karen passed by and wasn't looking. The tide, I realized, was shifting. Of course, Karen didn't take that well. She doubled down, calling an emergency meeting in the community church basement, bypassing the usual schedule to discuss what she called community safety and anti-goat protocols. She put up flyers with a picture of Carl the goat that read, "Do not approach. Potentially dangerous." I laughed so hard I had to sit down. The meeting was packed. Karen arrived early, dressed like she was testifying before Congress. She brought charts, diagrams, and an entire slideshow titled, "The Decline of Neighborhood Standards, a Case Study." I sat in the back with my arms crossed, letting her run the show. She was in rare form, spinning the goat incident into a full-blown tragedy. She used words like trauma and reckless endangerment and biological contamination. I nearly choked on my mint when she claimed she had to throw out 2 pairs of designer shoes due to hoof marks and goat musk. Then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Chambers, the oldest resident on the block, stood up. She was usually silent, invisible really, but tonight she cleared her throat and said, "Karen, I've lived here 45 years, and I've never seen someone do so much damage with a clipboard and a smile. Walter's barn has been here longer than your HOA rule book. It's where my grandkids took their first pony rides. And last week, it was the first time in years I saw people laugh around here. Laughter is not a violation." The room fell quiet. Karen's eyes darted around, searching for support, but nobody came to her defense. I felt something shift in that moment. The fear, the grip she had on this place, was cracking. All it took was a goat, or 57 of them, and one brave voice to remind people they still had their own. I stood up slowly, looked at the crowd, then at Karen. I didn't need to say much. The people were already seeing through the act, but I gave them a smile and said, "Well, if laughter is the problem, then I guess we all better prepare for a few more goats." The room erupted in applause. Karen sat down, red-faced, seething. And I knew then, this wasn't over. She'd be back with another plan, another fine, another printed regulation. But I was ready, because now, I wasn't alone. By the time the next week rolled around, the entire neighborhood was buzzing like a beehive with its lid off. People were picking sides, whispering in driveways, and attending HOA meetings like they were episodes of a reality show they suddenly cared deeply about. Karen, of course, treated it like a campaign trail. She walked the block with that tight-lipped smile and her color-coded clipboard, making subtle promises to some and veiled threats to others. You could almost hear the sound of paper shuffling behind her eyes as she plotted her comeback. The woman didn't know how to lose. She only knew how to escalate. That's how I found myself on a perfectly decent Thursday evening, sitting in the basement of the Briar Creek Baptist Church, where folding chairs and lukewarm coffee had transformed the space into what Karen called an official arbitration assembly. She had convinced the board to hold a community hearing to decide, once and for all, if I was in violation of HOA regulations and if disciplinary action should be taken. That was HOA speak for, let's publicly shame Walter and hope he rolls over. I had other plans. The room was full, not like the usual board crowd who showed up because their spouse made them, or because they hoped for free snacks. No, This was a full house. People brought folding chairs from home. There were teenagers on the windowsills. Even old man Patterson, who hadn't left his recliner in 2 years, had been wheeled in just to see the drama unfold. You could feel it in the air. Something was going to happen tonight, and nobody wanted to miss it. Karen stood at the front, next to a projector she brought from home. She had slides, graphs, photographs of goats in my yard zoomed in for maximum menace. One of Carl sticking his head out of her car window was displayed like evidence in a court trial. She started slow, measured, reciting bylaw numbers with the rhythm of a TED Talk speaker. According to Article 6, Section 3, no livestock shall be kept on any residential lot unless approved by the board. She even brought a little laser pointer, circling words like a professor talking to students too dense to grasp the material. Her voice never cracked, her spine never bent. She was in her element, basking in the power of process. Then she opened the floor for public comment. The first few were what I expected. Karen's loyalists, mostly folks who had lawn awards or brunches with her on Saturdays, stood and voiced their concern. They talked about safety, property values, and the disturbing trend of non-compliance in the community. One guy even said the goats traumatized his golden retriever. I wasn't sure if he meant emotionally or spiritually, but I didn't interrupt. Then came the unexpected shift. Henry stood up. He held his hands behind his back and cleared his throat. I've lived next to Walter for 10 years. He's the guy who helped fix my fence after a storm, who lent me his ladder when I didn't have one, and who never once complained when my kids played baseball too close to his truck. The goats, they weren't an attack. They were a reaction. A man defending his home in the only way left to him. There were a few nods. Then Mrs. Jensen got up. She'd been on Karen's side for years, but now she looked tired, worn out from the drama. She said, "Maybe instead of arguing about goats, we should talk about how we let one person have too much say over everything." People started clapping, quietly at first, like they weren't sure if it was allowed, then louder, as if they were shaking off years of submission. Karen's face didn't move, but I could see the tension in her jaw. Then came the real turning point. Mrs. Chambers stood up again, this time holding a photograph. It was a picture of the barn, 20 years ago, back when we first moved in. There were kids sitting on hay bales, neighbors laughing, Maggie standing in the background with her gardening gloves still on, holding a lemonade. She held it up and said, "This was before the HOA started running everything like a business. This was when we were neighbors, before fines replaced friendships." There was silence, real silence, the kind that makes you feel something heavy is about to shift. I stood up then. I didn't prepare a speech. I didn't bring slides or charts, just my voice. I told them about Maggie, about how we moved here for peace and ended up in the middle of an ongoing referendum about bird feeder heights and mailbox paint. I said I wasn't against order. I just missed kindness. I missed a world where people knocked before walking into your barn and didn't treat goat ownership like a federal crime. Karen tried to cut me off, said I was veering off topic, but the room wasn't listening to her anymore. I looked around and said, "Maybe I'm too old for this place now. Maybe the rules matter more than people. But if that's true, then what are we really protecting here?" The room stayed quiet. Then someone from the back said, "Let the man keep his goats." And the room burst into applause. Karen lost control in that moment. She tried to regain it, banging a little wooden gavel she brought with her. This isn't an official vote. This is not procedurally valid. But nobody was listening. They were standing now, clapping louder, some chanting, "Walter! Walter!" It felt ridiculous and heartwarming all at once, like winning a revolution in a church basement. The HOA board, sensing the shift in mood and probably fearing for their re-election, called for a voice vote. Should the fines be rescinded and the incident considered closed? A chorus of yes filled the room. Karen's no was the only one that echoed. They stripped her of her presidency right there, citing abuse of power and loss of community trust. She stood frozen, mouth open, blinking as if she couldn't comprehend a world where she wasn't in charge. Then, slowly, she gathered her papers, her projector, and her pride and walked out. No goodbye, no dramatic speech, just silence. I walked home under the stars that night. The air was crisp, the sky clear. When I opened the barn door, the goats were sleeping soundly, curled up in little piles of fur and stubbornness. Carl lifted his head for a moment, then went back to sleep. I stood there for a while, soaking it in. Not the victory, but the peace. The sense that something had been set right again. Not by force, not by yelling, but by the simple act of refusing to be pushed around, by remembering that community doesn't come from control, it comes from connection. And I knew right then that this wasn't the end. It was just the first time in a long while that it felt like home again. The days after the meeting felt different, like the whole neighborhood had exhaled after holding its breath for too many years. There was no parade, no official announcement, but you could see it in the way people waved a little longer from their driveways, how folks lingered on porches just to talk, and how the usual weight that hung in the air like thick summer humidity had finally lifted. Karen's white SUV was gone, and with it, the fear of citations for leaving a garden hose uncoiled or planting begonias 3 inches too far from the walkway. No one said where she went, but rumor had it she moved in with her sister in Florida, where the only HOA was managed by a parrot rescue group. Fitting, in a strange, comic way. I went about my days quietly, not gloating, not making speeches, just fixing up the barn, spending time with the goats, and enjoying the sudden, surprising company of neighbors who now seemed to treat the old man with the goat army like a local legend. Kids started showing up in 2s and 3s, asking if they could pet Gary or feed Niblet. Parents came too, a little shy at first, like they weren't sure if they needed to sign a waiver or something. But when they saw the barn filled with light, laughter, and not a single laminated rule, they loosened up quick. That's when it happened. Someone, I never figured out who, made a post online about what we were doing. A picture of a goat in sunglasses, a kid laughing while Princess Fuzzy tried to eat his shoelaces, and a caption that read, "The happiest place in Briar Creek has hooves." Overnight, the post blew up. It started local, then spread into neighboring towns, and suddenly people were calling to ask if they could drop by for goat therapy sessions. I didn't even know that was a real thing. Jorge laughed so hard when I told him. He nearly dropped a crate of feed. So, we rolled with it. Every Friday afternoon, we opened the barn to the community. No admission fee, no rules except one. No yelling at goats and no clipboard diplomacy allowed. We set up hay bales for sitting, little buckets of food pellets for feeding, and even a corner for brushing the older goats who liked attention. I called it Goat Therapy Fridays. Some people came for the novelty, others came for the peace. Veterans, widows, stressed-out parents, overworked teachers, they all showed up. And every time, they left smiling a little softer, standing a little taller. The barn, once a symbol of conflict, became a sanctuary. The goats, once viewed as an act of rebellion, became ambassadors of calm. And me? Well, I just kept the coffee hot and made sure nobody stepped in anything they'd regret later. It was simple, honest, a little chaotic, but it was real. One day, as I was fixing a hinge on the barn door, Jorge showed up with a little goat in his arms. She was pure white, with a tuft of brown over her left ear and a look that said she was already planning to climb something she shouldn't. He handed her to me without a word, just a grin stretched across his face. I looked at the goat, then at him. "She yours?" I asked. "Not anymore," he said. "Thought your herd could use a new addition." I cradled the little thing for a moment, felt her soft breath against my chest, and then, before I could stop myself, I laughed. "I think I'll name her Karen," I said. Jorge nearly fell over. "She'll be the first Karen around here who actually makes people happy." And she did. Little Karen became the star of Goat Therapy Fridays. She climbed into laps, danced on tables, and once managed to steal a sandwich straight from Henry's mouth. He said it was the best lunch he never ate. That goat had charm, mischief, and a sparkle in her eye that reminded me not to take life too seriously. As the months passed, the neighborhood changed, not drastically, just enough. People painted their mailboxes bright colors without worrying about citations. Garden gnomes reappeared like returning soldiers. Someone even painted a mural on the community fence. Bright, rolling hills, kids, animals, and right in the center, a goofy-looking goat wearing aviators. They named him Carl, of course. The real Carl stared at it for 5 minutes, then walked away, unimpressed. Then came the barbecue. I didn't plan it as anything official, just threw together some burgers and hot dogs, put up a few strings of lights in the yard, and told folks to come by if they felt like it. But by sunset, half the neighborhood was there. Kids played tag, teenagers helped set up tables, and old-timers like me sat on lawn chairs telling stories that got taller as the night went on. Someone brought a speaker, someone else brought pie, and before long, we had ourselves a celebration. At one point, people gathered around the picnic table where I was sitting, and someone, probably Henry, asked me to say a few words. I stood up, cleared my throat, and didn't say anything profound. Just thanked everyone for showing up, for coming together, for remembering that community isn't something written in a rule book. It's something you grow, protect, and share. Then I paused, pulled a small envelope from my pocket, and held it up. This here, I said, is my will. Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere just yet. But I made a few changes recently. Nothing major. Just wanted to make sure when I do kick the bucket, this barn doesn't turn into another HOA chess piece. People got quiet. I smiled and went on. I've left the barn to the community, but with one condition: it always stays full of goats. Doesn't matter if they are mine, Jorge's, or adopted from the next county over. As long as this barn has hooves and hay, it belongs to all of us. There was a beat of silence. Then someone started clapping. Then another. And soon the yard echoed with applause and cheers and a few whistles that scared the chickens into hiding. I sat back down, with a heart full of something I couldn't quite name, but felt an awful lot like peace. Later that night, long after the lights were off and the guests had gone, I stood by the barn, looking up at the stars. Little Karen nuzzled my leg, and in the distance, Carl snored loud enough to rattle the window panes. I thought of Maggie, of all the quiet years we spent here, of the noise Karen brought and the noise we sent back, and I realized that somehow, against all odds, the barn had become something more than it ever was. It started with a battle, turned into a rebellion, and ended in a revolution made of goats, laughter, and people who finally remembered what it meant to be neighbors. And if that isn't the most beautiful kind of justice, I don't know what is.